Hey folks, this is video number 1, How is Space Politically Organized? And you should take a second to set up your notes to reflect these key concepts. So let's talk about states and nations. So remember, a state is the exact same thing as a country. Just in geography, we use the term state instead. And a state has to meet 5 specific requirements. First of all, it has to have defined borders. And this is the concept of territoriality. And this is it really just basically means control over a space and ownership. The second thing it has to have is a defined permanent population. Oftentimes nomads can't establish states because the population moves so often. The third requirement is sovereignty. This is the idea of a people having full independence. They have a say in what goes on within their state. So this is a recognized right to control territory internally, militarily, and politically. So think about the protection of borders from other countries, as well as a say in the government. Speaking of a government, the fourth requirement is a functioning government. And then lastly, a state has to be internationally recognized. So other states in the world have to accept it, that it is its own state. So as of today, there's anywhere between 193 and 200 states. And so let's talk about first, what is a nation? So if a state is the legal concept, a nation is that cultural aspect. And it's very important that you know that distinction. And as of today, nations are gaining more and more power throughout the world and attempting to gain their sovereignty or their specific control over a territory. And so a nation is a group of people with these shared cultural and political goals that unify them together. And so nations can be created through language, religion, ethnicity, or a common future or a common past. So some examples are Palestinians, the French, Koreans. Here's an example of the Basques that we learned about last unit. They're considered a nation. Also think about like Belgium, the nations of the Flemish and the Walloon nations. This map here depicts where the Maori live in New Zealand. They are a nation. The Cherokee in the United States. The Scottish and the Welsh in Great Britain, or I'm sorry, the United Kingdom, and the Maasai. So here are the Maasai. They are living in East Africa, and they mostly reside in southern Kenya here, and northern Tanzania. And these people are nomadic, but they also have distinct cultural customs that really set them apart from the other people living in these areas. And lastly, an example is Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Think about it. They're considered nations. They have a common religion as well as a common history and idea for what the future should look like. And so for many nations, the control and maintenance of a territory is really crucial because that is how they control their national identity or the way of life. However, this rarely corresponds with political borders. And so that's why at the beginning of this slide, I let you know, oftentimes in modern day, people are more loyal to their nation than they are to their state, which causes some separatist movements. Okay, so how did we even get this state idea? There are 3 main events that you need to know about. The first is the Treaty of Westphalia, which was in 1648 and ended Europe's 30 Years' War. This was a treaty that negotiated peace among the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, which is this region right here. And why this is significant is because it recognized statehood and nationhood among these different princes. And so borders were clearly defined for the first time, and they were expected to be respected. This really guaranteed the security of these newly formed states. Another main process of developing this modern state idea was the French Revolution. So this was in 1789, and remember, this was the quest of the French people for sovereignty. So they believed that the monarchy should not control the government, that the people should control the government. And this is where we see a lot of Enlightenment ideas of self-contract and natural rights come out. And so they believed that democracy was the best. And so in theory, the nation of France should have its own sovereignty and control its own government. And so we see the French actually spread this idea of this modern state idea through colonialism and through promoting it in Europe. And then the last thing that also connects with colonialism is the Berlin Conference. Many of you have seen this cartoon before. Remember, in 1884, all of these European powers get together to discuss their territorial claims in Africa. And so remember, this was for their own benefit, and they kind of carved up Africa without regard for the people who lived there or their cultures, but only with regard for how could they benefit from gaining those territories. And so even though colonialism has ended, we still see the modern state idea being replicated today, and these arbitrarily drawn borders from the Berlin Conference actually have caused a lot of ethnic struggle up to the modern day. Okay, so different types of nations. First thing we're going to talk about is a nation state. This is a politically organized area in which a nation and states occupy the same space. So think about it. Nation, which is the cultural aspect, is the exact same as the state, which is the political or legal aspect. So a nation state has about 90% of the population that are a specific culture or group. And I want to remind you what we just talked about, that this goal of the nation state goes all the way back to the French Revolution. And so really today there aren't a whole lot of nation states, but it is important as a concept. And the reasons why many nations can retain homogeneous culture or ethnicity is oftentimes because there hasn't been a permanent invasion or mass migration from another culture. And these places are typically either like smaller states or island countries. And so some examples, Japan. Japan is comprised of 99% ethnically Japanese people. Iceland is another example. 94% of the people living in Iceland, you can see here, are from a Norse or Celtic ethnicity or heritage, and 81% of the people there are Lutheran. Another example is obviously France. They speak French. And then another example is Iran. So Iran is considered a nation state because 90 to 95% of the people living there are Shia Muslims. So this brings us to the other type of state. This is a stateless nation. And so the two largest stateless nations in the world are the Kurds and the Palestinians. And these are nations that do not have a specific territory to call their own. And so the Kurds are one example. This is the largest nationality in the world without its own state. There are anywhere between 30 and 40 million Kurds, and they're mostly located, you can see here, in Turkey, northern Iran, and Iraq, with a little bit in Syria. They speak their own language, and the majority of them are Sunni Muslims. And they actually comprise about 20% of the total population in Turkey and 10% in Iraq. And so there's this movement by the Kurds to gain sovereignty or autonomy, self-control, from Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Armenia, and to establish a new country called Kurdistan. Another example is the Palestinians. We mostly know this story. After World War II, the UN establishes the State of Israel on the previous territory of Palestine. And there's this partition between the two. This was the plan. However, you can see today it has ended up looking like this, which you can assume causes a lot of conflict. And so this happened because when the State of Israel was first established, the Arab Palestinians attacked, and this has really provoked the conflict up to the current day. The Israeli people have remained victorious, and have occupied places like the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Golan Heights. And they've constructed huge border walls and really forced the Palestinians to live in refugee camps on little land with little resources. And so this kind of perpetuates the conflict. And so resentment over the economics of the two different regions, as well as religion, has really caused this situation to continue being amplified. As a result, we see a lot of Palestinians that are forced to flee as refugees to other countries or live like refugees within Israel. Other examples of stateless nations are the Hmong in Southeast Asia, the Zulu in South Africa, and the Aborigines in Australia. And so I'm going to talk about the Hmong. This is an indigenous group that previously lived in Mongolia, and over the centuries they moved south into China. And the Chinese people, or the Chinese government, viewed them as less than or like barbaric, and they forced them kind of out of China. And so the Hmong were living within Vietnam and Laos almost like refugees. And during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, the Hmong aided the U.S. in their invasion of Vietnam. And so after the U.S. troops left, they were really persecuted for helping the enemy and aiding us Americans. So as a result, we see them now fleeing to Thailand, where most of them are living in refugee camps. The Zulu is another example, and they live in South Africa. There are about 10 million Zulu. They speak Zulu, which is the Niger-Congo family, and under the South African system of apartheid, which is legal segregation, the Zulu were forcibly segregated away from the white population of South Africa, and they were segregated in this land that was really infertile without access to resources. And so up to the current day, so apartheid ended in 1994, but the Zulu are still considered, second-class citizens without a distinct place of their own. I also have Europe's Roma here. These are people that we oftentimes hear of. We hear them being called gypsies. And these people are really spread all throughout Eastern Europe. There are about 10 million of Europe's Roma. They all speak different dialects of Romani, and they are also adherents of different religions. However, they face tons of social discrimination in Europe. And then lastly are the Aborigines in Australia. These are the indigenous people that lived there before Great Britain occupied Australia, and they're still kind of fighting for their rights to the land. Okay, so multinational states or multi-ethnic states are what the majority of states are today. This is a state that contains two or more distinct cultural groups, and the largest multinational state is Russia. There's 39 different ethnicities living there. And the most notable group is the Chechens. This is a group of Muslims who speak a Caucasian language. They live right here, and they are distinctively different than the Russians. They declared independence in 1991. However, Russia did not allow that to happen because in Chechnya there are vast petroleum deposits. And so this is a conflict that is still ongoing. Other examples of multi-ethnic states are like the former Yugoslavia with the different ethnicities that were living within it. And the United Kingdom is also an example of a multinational state. The Scottish, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish are all a part of the United Kingdom. Okay, so multi-state nations are the last thing we're going to talk about. This is a nation that stretches across borders. And this leads to irredentism, which is a movement to reunite a nation's homeland